2:30. People continue to trickle in, but I'm going to kick off the meeting now. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this online dialogue on decline and fall, the crisis of the global fossil fuel industry and outlook for Nigeria. My name is Jochen Luckschalter. I'm the head of the Heinrich Böll Foundation office in Abuja. For those of you who don't know us, the Heinrich Böll Foundation is a German political foundation affiliated to the Green Party in Germany. As we all know, the global oil industry has experienced major shocks due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. The much reported fall in oil prices into negative territory and OPEC's historic deal that slashed global output by about 10% were just two expressions of the huge pressure the industry experienced last year. Although the oil price has recovered somewhat in the meantime, the medium to long-term outlook of fossil fuel prices is bleak. While we may want to argue about the projected price levels and the speed with which the decline will take place, the central point and the consensus is that a fundamental energy transition is taking place, driven by ever cheaper renewable energies, investor skepticism about the future of the fossil fuel sector, and more aggressive government policies targeted at bringing the world closer in line with the 1.5-degree target of the climate Paris Agreement. While the transition has different implications for different oil and gas producing countries, the outlook for fossil dependent economies with little financial reserves and low economic diversification, such as the case in Nigeria, is of particular concern. Discussions about Nigeria's need to diversify its economy away from oil is of course not new. In fact, it's been going on for decades. Various Nigerian governments have presented their visions of how to diversify the economy. However, only limited progress has been made so far. So while the discussion has been ongoing for quite some time, what has changed, I believe, is that the urgency with which the discussion needs to take place. Diversification and lessening fossil dependence is, of course, easier said than done. Nigeria's reliance on oil revenues to keep the state running does not disappear overnight simply because we wish this to happen. But I'm convinced that the earlier Nigeria will start to take bold steps to reorient its economy and shift its energy balance towards renewables, the more it will be in control of the transition process, which otherwise will likely be highly disruptive, not only for the economy, but also for the political status quo and the social fabric of the country. In the end, it is in all our interests and responsibility that Nigeria and other petrostates succeed in reducing their dependence on oil and gas in order to lower the globe's carbon footprint in a way that is fair and equitable. For all these reasons, I am particularly excited about this dialogue here today and very much look forward to the presentations and the discussions and engagements with you as participants. And lastly, would like to take the opportunity to already thank the speakers for agreeing to contribute their time and insights. And also would like to thank our co-hosts, the Center for the Study of Economies of Africa and the Nigeria Natural Resource Charter, for their efforts to make this event happen. With this, I will hand over to Dr. Adedeji from CC, who will moderate the event going forward from here. Thank you very much. Adedeji.
Thanks so much, Jochen, for the introduction and setting the stage for the conversation this afternoon around how do we manage fossil fuel in Nigeria and how do we manage the transition to renewable energy. And we have three panelists that would be joining us this afternoon to discuss this issue. First, I have with me Kingsmill Bond, who is an energy strategist from Carbon Tracker. He will be presenting Decline and Fall, the crisis of the fossil fuel industry. Also, the second presenter, Tengi George Okoli, who is the program coordinator for the Natural Resource Charter, will be making a presentation about equipping the NMPC for the low carbon transition. And in our midst today, we have the Group General Manager of the Nigerian National Resource Corporation, who is unavoidably absent, but is well represented today by Engineer Adeyemi Adetunji, who is the Chief Operating Officer, NMPC Ventures and Business Development. So he will be presenting a paper on repositioning energy sector through balancing fossil and renewable energy sources, Nigeria perspective for sustainable development. So we will be having these three conversations, and that after their presentation, we'll open the floor for every one of us to ask questions, comment, and whatever contribution you can also add to this conversation. But before we go into their presentation, I will call on two people to make brief remarks. The first is Dr. Chukwuka Oyenkwena, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Study of Economics of Africa. The Chief Operating Officer, NMPC Ventures.
Chuka, we can't really hear you properly. I would suggest, sorry, Dr. Dechi, we can't really hear you properly. Dr. Chuka, if you could just go ahead with your welcome remarks. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so thank you, good ladies and gentlemen. It's quite a pleasure to be in this. You can see me now? So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's really a pleasure to be in this webinar which is on a very relevant issue. My name is Chukwuka Oyenkwena. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for the Study of the Economies of Africa, which is an economic think tank. We conduct evidence-based research to inform policies in Nigeria and Africa broadly. We work on several domestic areas, but the ones relevant to this webinar today is natural resources and energy, as well as public financial management. So today's topic is quite relevant and timely. It is a fundamental issue in Nigeria's public financial management discourse. The ongoing pandemic and the huge fall in crude oil prices has prompted a serious financial fiscal challenge for Nigeria. The debt levels have been rising significantly, and there are now questions about debt sustainability for Nigeria. So today, we are discussing the crisis in the global fossil fuel industry, where fossil fuel dependent countries will witness a significant drop of about 50% in revenues over the next 2 decades due to a shift towards low carbon options in energy, the renewable energy option. This transition would have implications for Nigeria as a heavily fossil fuel reliant country. So it will be interesting to see the presentations today on how Nigeria is prepared for this imminent transition, and what are the steps taken by the government to mitigate the potential negative impact in form of, government loss, reduction in government revenues, as well as job losses. How is Nigeria preparing for this transition? So I look forward to the key presentations of this webinar and to see how Nigeria is preparing towards this imminent energy transition taking place. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Chukwuka Oyekwena, for your brief remarks. I will just jump right to call on Engineer Adeyemi Adetunji for his own brief remarks also.
Good afternoon, all. My name is Yemi Adetunji from NNPC. Good to be here on this webinar. For us at NNPC, the issue of the crisis in the fossil fuel segment of the energy industry is real. However, we believe that Nigeria has some levers to pull to be able to manage, through these processes. One, we're also in line with what the global activities. We're also looking at renewable energy and in various forms, especially for solar, for wind and biofuels. I would believe those are the areas that Nigeria will be able to make some inroads. But back to fossil fuel, we strongly also believe, and we know that because of the level at which we are starting from, in terms of energy access and in terms of also industrialization, we see also quite some use, for gas especially. We want to use gas, and the Minister of the Petroleum Resources declared 2020 as the year of gas, and 2021 to 2029 as it is, as a decade of gas. So gas will be the linchpin on which we will be focusing on in the oil and gas industry. Gas is a cleaner form of energy, and we see that as going to play a big role in our transition, to cleaner fuels. And gas will also help us to bridge the gap we have in terms of energy access, and also to help to propel industrialization for the country. Of course, we see fossil fuels, all the liquids as well, being challenged, but we also have some plans, around, utilization of fossil fuels, which again we'll discuss further in the course of this presentation. And this also ties to the government aspiration of diversifying the economy. You could see government's plans, have aroused intervention in various sectors of the economy, from agri, mining, entertainment, and various other growth sectors that government is focusing on, and both encouraging from fiscal to direct intervention for funds for these areas. And those are part of activities that will help to ensure that the country has a robust economy going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Engineer Adetunji, for that very brief remarks and for setting the tone for the conversation. I think we can now jump straight into the conversation, and I will call on the first panelist, Kent Bond, who is an energy strategist from the Carbon Tracker. He will be giving a presentation this afternoon around decline and fall, the crisis of the fossil fuel industry. So over to you, King Smith.
Great, thank you very much, Adeniro, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I will now share my screen. My name is King Smith. I'm the strategist at Carbon Tracker, and Carbon Tracker is a think tank that analyzes the impact of the energy transition on financial markets. we popularized the terms carbon bubble and stranded assets. And our key observation is that the energy transition will have a dramatic and rapid impact on the fossil fuel system. That has become increasingly accepted globally over the last 18 months, although it is an argument we've been making for 10 years. My background is as a financial market strategist for companies like Deutsche Bank and Citibank, with a focus on Russia, the emerging markets and energy. And I will make today a similar presentation to the one we made at the end of last year to the Bank of England, at the heart of the financial system, because this is a global story. And I apologize, I'm not a Nigerian specialist, but I will seek to make it relevant to the situation in Nigeria. The message is, however, the same everywhere. The energy system is changing. It's changing fast. Companies and countries need to change or to fail. So I want to talk today about 5 things. First of all, to run through what is the term that we've been hearing for many years from the fossil fuel sector about eternally rising demand. Then I want to show what's changed and why this old argument is no longer accurate. I want to consider what financial markets are now signaling, to think what happens next, what should we anticipate taking place over the course of the 2020s. We've already heard from one speaker that the 2020s for them would be the decade of gas. I would suggest that's a dangerous idea. And then I want to conclude with what you can do to prepare for the change to come. So forgive the slightly fuzzy slide. This is the old story from Exxon. Perhaps it's appropriate to be fuzzy. The old story of ever-rising fossil fuel demand from one of the Exxon presentations. The story really is one of business as usual, constantly rising demand for fossil fuels. As you see in this graph in green, inappropriately, oil is rising, gas is rising, coal falls, but not by very much. And you can see wind and solar rising, but fortunately for Exxon, or the Exxon perspective, they don't rise by enough to really rock the boat. So what that means is continued high prices for oil and gas and continued high profits for incumbent fossil fuel majors who can continue to pollute with impunity. That's basically the idea. That's the old story. And actually, interestingly enough, before I plunge into why it's wrong now, it's actually been wrong for years. And one very good way to illustrate that is this data from on annual solar additions. So solar, just to remind you, is one of the number of new technologies, rapidly growing technologies, which challenges the status quo. The light blue line on the left is actual new additions, which has been growing very quickly on an exponential growth curve for 20 years. And then these straight flat lines is what the IEA has been forecasting. And the IEA is a good proxy for the fossil fuel perspective on the future. Is what they've been forecasting would happen for the last decade. So they've been forecasting flat linear growth in an exponentially growing market. They've been forecasting the same thing for 20 years. So actually, interestingly enough, the fossil fuel sector has failed to realize the speed of change and has failed to do so for many years. So if I move on then to the second part of this presentation, what's changed? Why is this old story wrong? So the first and traditional argument that we make is that you have this climate imperative, obviously, as we all know. Business as usual will take us to 4 or 5 degrees of global warming, which would render a very large proportion of the globe uninhabitable. And therefore we need to change. And that's, of course, what drove the Paris Agreement. And it's still a major factor driving politicians in the big energy consuming regions of Europe and China. But to be clear, and it's a point I also made when speaking to a Canadian audience, I'm not suggesting that the climate imperative is or needs to be a driver for Nigeria. It is, however, a driver for energy consumers who ultimately determine demand for fossil fuels. Because what that necessity has driven is a technology revolution. And what lies at the heart of this energy transition is this technology revolution. So it's not a carbon story, actually, or at least not anymore. Because you can do carbon stories with PR, right? You can pretend you're doing stuff, plant a few trees, and think it's all okay, the way Shell tells us. But actually, it's a real story. It's a real transition. It's a technology-driven shift. And companies like Kodak and Nokia, you can't sort out their problems with PR. It's a real shift. So over the last decades, we all know there's been a collapse in the cost of solar and wind and batteries, as we show in these charts. And then at the same time, there's been a spectacular exponential growth in the deployment of these new technologies. So solar, for example, has been doubling every 2 to 3 years for 2 decades. I don't need to remind you that anything that doubles every 2 or 3 years very quickly gets to a very large number. Anyway, what that's done is it's handed over the economic advantage to renewables. This is data from Bloomberg New Energy Finance on the cheapest source of electricity generation in the markets that they study. I'm sorry to say Nigeria is not covered by BNF here, but the point to me is that right across the world, from the United States to Australia, from China to India, from South Africa to Morocco, the cheapest source of electricity generation is now renewables. It's wind or solar. And so far, Africa, unfortunately, has been held back by a combination of weak policy environments, high cost of capitals, high local costs. But developers like Aqua are actually solving that problems in countries like Ethiopia, where you already have sub $50 solar. And in fact, interestingly enough, Africa is the world's greatest beneficiary from this energy revolution. We'll talk about more of that in a minute. But relative to demand, it has more solar and wind resources than any other region in the world. The continent has enough solar and wind resources to meet total energy demand 1,000 times over. And the numbers are enormous. So for example, for Nigeria, according to Solagist, Nigeria has an annual solar technical potential on available land of 76,000 terawatt hours, which is 250 times as much as your oil production and 2,000 times as much as your electricity demand. So you can be sure that over time, this revolution will come to Africa. And in fact, I think the story is even better than that. Africa will leapfrog the old fossil fuel development path and go straight to renewables. And why? Because renewables are cheaper, cleaner, faster, and above all, local. If you want energy to power a continental renaissance, renewables has the answer. But anyway, I'm talking more in general terms here. So the economic advantages has switched to renewables, and of course it just keeps on getting better. So this is a chart of the cost of wind and solar in China versus existing assets, not even new assets, but existing assets. And you see solar and wind breaking through the cost curve of existing assets really quite quickly. And what that means, therefore, is it's not merely there's no growth, but actually even the incumbent systems are getting closed down. And in the United States and in Europe today, they're already closing gas plants because they're no longer economic. Right across the world, they're closing coal plants because they're no longer economic. So the story just keeps on getting better. And it is, of course, equally sequenced by country. So people often say to us in Carbon Tracker, look, you know, you guys sitting in your ivory tower, you know, it's great for Denmark, it's great for all these rich countries, but it's not appropriate for poorer countries. Actually, this argument is wrong. Every single country in the world is going through an energy transition. And as usual, there are leaders and there are laggards. So you can think about it in the terms of the 4 classic phases of change on an S-curve. You have spring, summer, and autumn and winter. So certain countries like Germany or Denmark have got to 50% penetration, then the autumnal period of change. Other countries like Morocco are in a kind of summer moving towards autumn at 20% penetration. East Africa, for example, is now 8% penetration. And then there are laggards. In the Middle East is about 1%, Russia or CIS is less than 1%. And actually, what determines the leaders and laggards is not the quality of the renewable resource, but the power of the fossil fuel incumbency to resist change. And as I will suggest in a minute, resisting change is very, very bad, both for you and for your population, even if you're in a petro state. So if you want to look at an emerging market leapfrog, look at India. India can generate solar from electricity from solar at $40 per megawatt hour. They're already talking about peak demand for fossil fuels and electricity in India when they have less than 1/10 of the US level of electricity consumption per person. Or indeed look at China, which has leapfrogged actually the United States in every aspect of the energy transition. This revolution, which started in electricity, which incidentally is 40% of primary energy demand, is spreading to transportation. And here really in transportation, we have a very similar story. Collapse in battery prices, they've now reached or gone below the fabled $100 per kilowatt hour, at which point you get cost price parity between electric vehicles and conventional cars. And as a result of that, every car manufacturer in the world, you know, I see a new one this morning is Volvo decided they're going to stop producing ICE cars. Even GM a couple of weeks ago said they would stop in 2035. Basically, everyone is now getting out of ICE cars very, very quickly. And even the slowest analysts can figure out when oil demand for cars is going to stop. You put it in a spreadsheet and it finishes quite quickly, actually. So the point to me is that it's now spread to transportation, and actually the revolution is spreading right across the entire fossil fuel system. So today, in every single sector, there are people hunting for carbon-free solutions, often with the active support of governments in Europe and China. So for those who argue that oil demand, for example, can be saved by plastics or aviation, this is simply a delusional argument. First, because growth in these small sectors of demand cannot possibly offset decline in the much larger sectors of light transportation. And secondly, because those sectors themselves are also facing the same combination of regulatory and technical change that coal, electricity, and cars faced before them. So what's now happening? This story is being supercharged by politics. So it's a technology shift supercharged by politics, much easier than the other way around. So the political leaders of the world, as you know, decided to get to net zero by the end of the century. Think about the change since the end of last year. China in September, Japan in October, the US in November. And this chart shows what that means. It means that we're on a very, very quick decline rate to zero for these fossil fuels. And please do not believe the stories that the incumbents tell you about planting trees and CCS. And I see the latest mad idea is transporting Saudi crude to Korea and then shipping back carbon. These are all high-cost, complex solutions that are needed to curtail existing carbon emissions from land use and to solve the hard-to-solve sectors such as petrochemicals at the end of the transition. They are simply too small and too expensive to allow for continued fossil fuel production. So do not make the mistake of the coal sector and mistake propaganda for reality and go bust. Okay, what does all this stuff mean? This means peak fossil fuel demand, and peak fossil fuel demand incredibly soon. In fact, we at Carbon Tracker and other forecasters such as DNVGL think that peak fossil fuel demand was 2019. There's a slightly boring debate about whether or not, as McKinsey suggests, we get to a slightly higher level in the mid-2020s. But the point simply is that we have hit a plateau for fossil fuel demand. And I try and illustrate it here with a Shell Sky scenario. You see the dotted line, that's what they were expecting beforehand for oil demand to keep on rising. Then you get the damage of COVID. By the time demand returns, it's going to be really struggle to get back to previous levels of demand. So coal clearly on a downward, started down its downward cliff. Oil has reached a plateau. It'll plateau for a while and then go off the cliff. Gas is a few years till it reaches its own peak and then will decline precipitously after that. So it's a very similar story across all three fossil fuels. And what it also means is spectacular growth for renewables. So we illustrate this with DNVGL, with data from solar and wind, with the amount of electricity that they believe is going to be generated. In fact, I should say exajoules here, and the amount of electric vehicles which they forecast being necessary in this kind of world. Because this is the other side of the story. There's an enormous opportunity, of course, in the energy transition and a huge amount of growth to come. So for those like Africa who missed out on the fruits of the fossil fuel revolution, this, of course, is a fantastic opportunity. This is your chance. Okay, let me come on to the third part of the presentation. What do investors say? What do financial markets tell you? I mean, it's all very well for me to sit here and spin a story, but what are financial markets saying? So Larry Fink is chairman of BlackRock, the world's biggest asset manager. And in early 2020, just before COVID, he made the following point. He said, look, financial markets see change coming and they react early. And in so doing, they bring change forward. And this precisely is what is happening. Investors can see that the fossil fuel sector will be damaged by the energy transition. So in sector after sector, they have been derating incumbents for years. The European electricity sector peaked in 2007. Global coal sector peaked in 2011, a decade ago. the oil services sector peaked in 2012. And we're illustrating here the energy sector share of the S&P 500 index. It's been declining for a decade, from 13% to 3% of the index. And actually 2020 was when the mainstream investors really woke up to what's going on in this energy transition. So we illustrate that here with the clean energy index in red, which went up by 130% in 2020, versus the S&P energy index, which is basically the fossil fuel sector, which went down by 40%. So you get this massive bifurcation. And I would suggest that's an illustration of the market waking up really quite rapidly to what is going on. Coming on now to the fourth part of this presentation before I conclude with what to do. What's going to happen next? I think, really important point to make here, and again, coming back to why it's not a great idea to get into gas now, is because you're going to have continued relentless cost falls of renewable energy sources, of solar and wind and batteries. And that just means that anyone today building any kind of fossil fuel asset is going to find that their forecasts for future demand and future prices are wrong, because they're facing an absolutely huge and a very powerful competitor with very rapidly falling costs. So you're going to have relentless cost falls. Furthermore, you're going to have peaking demand right across the system. So to remind you, you had peak demand for fossil fuels in the OECD 16 years ago in 2005, peak turbine demand in 2011, which damaged GE, peak coal demand in 2013, peak ICE car demand in 2017. We would suggest peak oil demand and peak fossil fuel demand in 2019. The jury's still out on that issue. But the point simply is that as these changes come through, you're going to get peaks in sector after sector right across the energy system. And what do peaks mean? Peaks mean stranded assets. So as soon as you get to peak demand, you get stranded assets. And this is what this chart's trying to illustrate. In red is what incumbent actual sales are. The dotted purple line is what they think they're going to be. Just look at the Exxon forecast, for example. And then green is the challengers. And I notice as an aside, it's often the case that challengers are very, very small when they take all of the growth in any system. That's quite normal, actually. And the fossil fuel system is incredibly vulnerable. This is the point we were making to the Bank of England. There's $10,000 billion of fossil fuel extraction assets out there, $18,000 billion of fossil fuel linked equity at risk, and $8,000 billion of debt, and very significant amounts of banking sector debt. So all of this stuff becomes actually quite vulnerable as the transition starts to take off. Because what it means is you shift from full cost price to a new equilibrium price, which is lower. Again, basic economics. I won't bore you with how it works. I'm sure you all know this. But what this means then is three interesting things. First of all, you get stranded assets. So famously, the oil sector has written off about $200 billion of assets in the last 12 months. That's just the beginning, incidentally. Secondly, you get lower profits right across the board because you get lower price. And then thirdly, and this is the most dangerous thing for the petrostates, you get much lower rent. So petrostates have been massive beneficiaries of the fact that they can get oil out of the ground for $20 and sell it for 60 or 80. That's rent. That's the gap between those two, is rent. You take that money, you get out of the ground, and then you have a lot of fun with it. That game, sadly, for the petrostates is drawing to a close. And therefore, what that means is huge stresses for the petrostates. So Carbon Tracker released a report a couple of weeks ago looking at the implication of the transition for the petrostates, which was referenced by one of the speakers earlier. Basically, half of the revenues are now at risk. And we rank the petrostates 1 to 5, tier 1 to 5, in terms of the oil and gas's share of government revenue versus the potential risk to government revenue and potential risk to revenues. And sadly, countries like Nigeria, like in tier 4, one of the most risky countries in the world from this transition. And it's not just us. So Fitch, the debt analysis company, is ranking petrostates today by their risk factors. The World Bank has released a report actually a long time ago called From Rents to Risks, saying that fossil fuels basically used to generate rents, now they generate risks. And so Fitch is ranking countries based on fossil fuels as a share of exports, fossil fuel receipts as a share of the total, and sadly, again, Nigeria, as you can see from the chart, is orange and red in many areas of the chart. And what it means is that countries that do not diversify are going to find it very hard to raise capital. However, fortunately, as I mentioned earlier, this also creates extraordinary new opportunities. This is data from Solagis on the practical photovoltaic solar power potential across the world. And there is this extraordinary silver lining. Just look at the map. So Europe, for example, has got this really rubbish insolation. We don't have a lot of sunshine. It's very, very high, and the seasonality is terrible. But of course, with Africa here at the center of the map, it's got fabulous insulation. It's got great seasonality. And to be clear, money is now available. Developers right across the world will today direct capital to those countries that put in place an enabling policy environment to exploit renewables. And there's excellent work done on this by the World Bank and by Bloomberg New Energy Finance, actually, about how any country in the world can now attract capital to exploit this opportunity. So my final slide before I hand over is, what can you do? The first point surely is you've got to ignore the incumbent forecasts for the future of energy. I mean, it's basically like buying a second-hand car from a car salesman. None of these forecasts are credible, quite frankly. Secondly, you need to plan for structural change, not cyclical change. This is not another cycle and it's going to be back to the races, and we just have to do what the Canadian government, for example, thinks, that they just have to prop up the industry for 6 months and then they can carry on generating money anymore. That's not going to happen anymore. Thirdly, you need to assume a structural decline in fossil fuel prices with cyclicality around that. We're not so naive as to imagine that fossil fuel prices are going to move down a straight line, but it's going to move downwards over time, inevitably, because of the logic of economics competing with superior, cheaper technologies on learning curves. The fourth thing too, again, mentioned by a speaker earlier, you've got to reinvent away from fossil fuels before it's too late. I mean, think about risk. You have a country which is very deeply dependent upon revenues from fossil fuels. The idea of building out new fossil fuel infrastructure into such an environment, fossil fuel infrastructure planned for 40 years, but it's going to be obsolete within 10, it's just a risk control issue. It's very, very risky. It's also very risky to increase oil supply right now at a moment when nobody actually wants it anymore. And then the final point, the very optimistic point surely, is that now is the time to embrace this renewable future where of course Nigeria and many other countries have enormous wealth. And as I said earlier, Nigeria has 250 times as much solar as it does oil. That's where the opportunity now lies. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much and hand back to the moderator.
Thanks so much, Kingsmill, for that wonderful presentation and overview of the conversation. I mean, just to summarize your presentation, renewable energy is the future because technology has made it cost-effective and it's cleaner, and country either have to transit or decline. I see that as a central message of your presentation, both for petro state and non-petro state. So thanks for that conversation. So Kingsmill, if you can look through the Q&A window or the chat box, there's a lot of questions already dropping for you. If you can start responding to that, I mean, we might not have enough time at the end of the day to go over all the questions that people might have. So if we can respond to that, but note that after this other presentation, we'll go into Q&A section. So over to you, Tengi George Ikoli, for your presentation around how do we prepare an NPC for the transition.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction, Deji. And thanks to HBS as well for our partnership on this, as well as CC. My name is Tengi George Ikoli, and I serve as Nigerian Natural Resource Charters Program Coordinator. The NNRC has been around for about 8 years. We started off in about 2012, and we've been engaging on natural resource governance over that time. We focus primarily on oil and gas reforms, and have also expanded into solid mineral reforms. And given the context of what's going on, the global transition, we are also exploring other opportunities around renewables and how we can fully exploit our natural resources, specifically oil and gas and solid minerals, to position Nigeria for the inevitable transition that it will have to make. So I will put my presentation up now. So the title of this presentation is Equipping NNPC for a Low Carbon Transition. I'll be speaking to this from the perspective of the NNRC and the charter which we implement called the Natural Resource Charter. And that provides us basically with 12 benchmark indices, taking lessons from other regions, other resource-rich countries that have been more successful in managing their natural resources. And we'll take the lessons from that and also from other NOCs around the world as well, ways in which NNPC can first improve the way in which it is managed and run, and then provide examples and recommendations and how it can position itself for the next phase for a low carbon transition. So I will look at what are the implications of the energy transition for NNPC and Nigeria, looking at the global perspective, Nigeria, and then specifically NNPC. Some of that has already been discussed by Kingsmill and engineer Yemi Adetunji as well. Then I'll look at why is reform essential, and then what should be done. So in terms of the context, first, we're looking at the crisis of global fossil fuel industry and the different impacts that have come across the energy industry, specifically oil and gas, in the last couple of years. Well, the first issue that has come up has been the COVID-19 crisis, which has been quite a blow and a hit to the industry and global economy in general. We had the demand destruction, obviously, which was precipitated by a slowdown in the economies due to the COVID-19 crisis. We had some recession, recession, which we believe will take a couple of years to recover from. Then there's the climate change initiative, which has already been spoken about. So we have the COP21 occasioned by the Paris Agreement. So there's the decarbonization initiative and the carbon neutrality aims. You have countries like UK, Japan, and Republic of Korea committing to 2050, and other countries like China committing to 2060, and Sweden coming to 2045. Then you have cheaper energy storage. You have cheaper renewable energy, which has already been discussed and by the two different speakers. So we have solar, wind, and other renewables. Nigeria is actually positioned for solar already as well. So we are a very rich economy in already fossil fuels, but we also have other comparative advantages in solar and in gas as well, which is important for Nigeria to start to position itself for those opportunities. So we also have green hydrogen fuel as well, which Nigeria can also position itself to take advantage of. So then as the world moves forward, the oil industry is becoming a reminder of the past. This was also touched on by Kingsville for different reasons. The oil industry is now one of the worst performing sectors in the financial market. That has already been explored by Kingsmill. But again, we have an extraction here looking at the S&P 500. And just to note that that in 1980, the energy industry accounted for about 25% of the index's value, and there were about 7 out of the 10 oil companies. And then in July 2020, we have oil companies accounting for 2.8%, which is a huge depression, which shows the shift away from fossil fuels to a larger energy mix. You can see at the bottom of the diagram here, where you have from 1990 to 2005, you had a lot more activity and returns to shareholders at that period, and that continues to depreciate. And naturally, there is likely going to be that interest from shareholders as well to deviate to where areas where they can get more returns, which is essentially renewables. And then again, I've already mentioned in terms of the COVID-19 crisis, we had a component of time where we had zero oil scenario in terms of the futures, which really should have resonated with Nigeria in terms of this is where we would be when these sort of scenarios happen again. Nigeria had to cut its budgets as a result, because our budget is pegged on our oil revenues. And that should have also signaled to Nigeria that we need to diversify more and take this diversification a lot more seriously, because our reliance on on fossil fuel for our foreign exchange receipts puts us in a very, very bad position in terms of the economy. We are over 200 million people, and if our reliance is solely on fossil fuels, if another recession or depression happens again, then we'll be in a lot of trouble. In the next 40 years, the demand for our oil is likely to depreciate as well. So a lot of consideration, a lot more beyond just thinking about it, but actually taking action is necessary for our economy to continue to thrive. During the COVID-19 scenario as well, we increased our burden of our debt quite high. We borrowed from IMF, borrowed from the World Bank, and those borrowing are always financed by our foreign exchange receipts, which again is tied to oil and gas industry. So this is putting Nigeria in a very, very bad position. And then in the post-Paris Agreement world, renewables play a leading role, whereas the prominence of oil is set to diminish. I think that's a general understanding from everyone that this is likely to happen in the next couple of years, in the next 40 years. Nigeria does not want to be in a situation where it's still looking at oil and gas in the next 50 years or 60 years when the world has moved on. In that instance, there could be riots, there could be other issues. We saw during the COVID-19 crisis when people were very poor, people were suffering, and there was the SARS incident, and a lot of people went clamoring for those goods that had been saved to be served as reliefs. But this just demonstrates how much poverty there is in the land, shows how unprepared that people are as individuals, and so Nigeria has to start taking responsibility, the government, to position us to not go into those sort of scenarios. Similar to as well the Venezuela scenario as well. So we need to start taking these cues from what's going on in other countries and the signals as well to not put ourselves in those sort of situations moving forward. So I've mentioned a lot of this already. So Nigeria is in trouble. Its oil dependency is unsustainable. I've mentioned the fact that Nigeria continues to peg its budget to oil as well. And what happens when oil is no longer a going concern, or we don't expand that basket, then Nigeria we're left in a very precarious situation. But the good news is that Nigeria already has a lot of solar potentials that it can leverage, as well as gas in terms of hydrogen. So in just creating the infrastructure for those things, I think is very important. Kingswood had mentioned that we might want to pause, but we don't have a strong enough infrastructure. So it's still important, I think, for Nigeria to start to develop those, get investments into that space, so that we can be properly and appropriately positioned for when that time comes. And then, NNPC's inefficient refineries are draining public money. That point here was just to say that we got the audited reports from NNPC in 2020, and that shows sort of the inefficiencies within the refineries because of the losses that had been incurred. Nigeria has to be very careful in the ways in which it spends its existing capital, its existing revenue, because in the next few years, Nigeria will not have access to those revenues, will have depreciating revenues in that regard. And so being very judicious in the assets that we keep running is very important. So it might be worth considering privatizing those assets beyond just sort of making policy statements. Yes, I think I've made reference to these points. So the next conversation I was looking at, why is reform essential for Nigeria? And that's around the climate change agenda conversation, which I've already highlighted. The world is moving away from fossil fuels, but Nigeria certainly still has its needs and its demands. So we can, while looking at what the world is doing and positioning ourselves for the future, Nigeria can also take these necessary steps given those contexts. So we considered a couple of NOCs, looking at what steps these NOCs are taking, but also looking at how they are currently operating to try to maximize revenues and maximize benefits from their fossil fuel resources as well, to make sure that they're positioned to fully diversify, or at least extract as much benefit as they can from the resource while the world is transitioning away from oil potentially. So we looked at Norway's Equinor, Brazil's Petrobras, Malaysia's Petronas, Saudi Arabia's Saudi Aramco, and Algeria's Sonatrach. So here now we're looking at what should be done, the critical reforms that should focus on strengthening the governance of NNPC to position it as a credible actor in energy transition. So here I'll just briefly highlight what the NNRC does and how it can provide best practice recommendations for NNPC in terms of what it can do now to ensure that it improves its functionality, to ensure that it's able to properly guide Nigeria or play a very pivotal role in terms of the future of energy transition. So in terms of what the NNRC does, we implement the Natural Resource Charter, which is a 12 principle-based charter that advises in terms of how resource-rich countries can fully exploit their natural resources. And we have done this over the last 4 years. And these are the findings that we had over the last four years. I only want to emphasize the precept 6, which is the precept that mandates that resource-rich countries are in a better position to provide value and benefits for their resource countries, where they're able to stick to a very viable and commercial mandate and operate in a very fiscally and commercial standpoint. So what the Natural Resource Charter looks at is in terms of role and funding, corporate governance, and transparency and accountability. So it asks a series of questions. In terms of the role and funding, we look at if the government clearly defines a commercial role and potentially even a non-commercial roles, and establish a working funding mechanism for the company. And also in terms of corporate governance, if these NOC limits political interference in the company's technical decisions while ensuring effective oversight. And then in terms of decision-making, in terms of transparency and accountability, we look at whether or not decision-making and operations are transparent and accountable. So what we have here are the scores that were credited within our 2019 benchmark exercise report. And then we look at the components of suggestions of the petroleum industry bill so far, and just some highlights, high-level recommendations. So in terms of the first component, which is around role and funding, we note that the NNPC, that is in a hybrid, and its funding mechanism was not predictable. So in terms of it has some commercial roles, but also has some non-commercial roles. So that is into regulation, into policy, whereas potentially a more focused mandate might help to allow it to focus really on increasing the value that is necessary for Nigeria to be able to benefit and potentially provide more, as much revenue as can be possible to Nigeria's federal allocation. NNPC's broad discretion in defining its mandate, again, this is speaking to its commercial role, that it diversifies and goes beyond the oil and gas mandates and has other focus areas, about 17 wholly owned subsidiaries, 16 partially owned subsidiaries. It delves into the health sector, into education sector, but those components are not necessarily part of its core focus. And if it just maybe streamlined a bit more in the next couple of years to help it focus a lot more into the oil and gas, trying to extract the most value for Nigeria, that might be beneficial. And then changes to, this was the BER now noted that changes to NNPC's funding arrangements improve NNPC's ability to meet its joint venture obligations. But in terms of looking forward, some clarity is needed in terms of how NNPC can move forward. The PIB provides some outlines in terms of this. However, there is not any mention of a transition focus for NNPC beyond that or for Nigeria moving forward in the PIB, which we believe is a missed opportunity which Nigeria can still take advantage of and leverage. So we suggesting that some provision be made around section 64J of the PIB, which can be taken a look at a later date. Then in terms of the corporate governance, we note that it is wholly state-owned and decision-making is vested within the single state actor, which is the president. Even though that provides for a more cohesive and strategic decision-making, it still provides or limits checks and balances, which will be necessary to make sure that we get a more broader viewpoints in terms of how the NOC is managed for the benefit of Nigeria. The board composition of NNPC board of NNPC is within the NNPC Act as currently constituted. However, we note that in the PIB, there's one of the sections potentially undermines the provisions mandating professional and independent the board, because it requires the president to appoint these key actors within the new structure that the NNPC will take, which is NNPC Limited. It appoints the non-executive chairman, the chief executive of NNPC, and all the representative of Ministry of Petroleum Resources, Ministry of Finance, and all the other roles. So we're suggesting that potentially limiting political interference will allow that to be reduced. Maybe potentially have the National Assembly be the ones to approve that recommendation, or to play some key role in terms of maybe recommendations from a different independent body. And then you have the last component, which is around transparency and accountability. We note that NNPC has embraced a lot more transparent activities. It has an initiative called TAPE, for instance. It has partnered with NATI to be a lot more transparent. However, there are other requirements that are not fully adhered to within the EITI principles in terms of beneficial ownership of takers not being fully committed to having the cost of operations not being clearly outlined, and then no information on these non-commercial rules and how it expects to reduce that or not, so that way there can be a little bit more of awareness and also checking of those activities if they go outside of the scope of what Nigerians potentially believe the NNPC should be focused on. Okay, then we look at 5 other NOCs and how they fare against the benchmarking exercise reports. Here we just sort of look at those 5 NOCs that we mentioned. We see here the way Petrobras, I think, is more closely linked to the way Nigeria's NNPC. Just a point to note here is that in terms of transparency and accountability and having a well-defined mandate, Petrobras is very clear on its mandate, although it can be slightly murky because of government interference and political interference. But even in spite of that, we found that Petrobras operates optimally and provides returns. Not that we're endorsing that sort of approach, but just a point to highlight here is that a commercial mandate keeps an NOC prioritized on its goals and creates an opportunity where it's likely to succeed in creating as much value as possible for its host country. Okay, so this just looks at the different components of the precepts again, which I'd already mentioned. So this looks at a working funding mechanism and clearly defined rule and mandates. So the NOCs that I've mentioned are publicly listed. So obviously this is an appropriate suggestion or appropriate recommendation that NNPC can take on in the PIB. One issue to note, I guess, is in terms of the PIB, it's silent on the takeoff investment for NNPC, and that remains a great concern because one of the issues that NNPC has had over the years is in terms of being fiscally viable and being able to fund its joint venture agreements, but joint venture and so it's important then to have that really clearly stated out as well and taking those lessons from these other more successful NOCs. And then you have in terms of the corporate governance structure as well, that was also in the previous slide, which has a lot more technically competent hands within that structure. So the PIB does make some provision for this in that it provides for expertise with someone with experts above 15 years experience, but then that should be PIB. And then you have in terms of decision making and operations and transparency and accountability, most of these countries apply to the EITI, adopt the EITI. So there is some component of that as well, which Nigeria is not doing so bad in over at least the last couple of years. So just to summarize, in strengthening the governance of NNPC to position it, these are the examples that we've taken from the other NOCs. So in terms of the role and funding, it's important for NNPC to clarify its funding mechanism and its revenue retention model, because this will sort of set a path for whether how successful NNPC is at achieving its goals. We've talked about potentially NNPC positioning itself to be a coordinator or player in terms of energy transition. But if these things are not properly adhered to, then the chances of NNPC being able to play a pivotal role here would be difficult. Then the government could also sign a management contract with NNPC that includes clear performance indicators. Again, this is in line with the role of NNPC to make sure that NNPC is meeting its obligations. This is potentially, even if an NNPC becomes privatized, it would still have some form of accountability. I guess we have accountability to shareholders and also have accountability for the Nigerian people as well. Here, potentially, we might want to consider the NLNG model, which has been working a lot more than NNPC potentially has done on its own. And then we have the corporate governance recommendations, which is to eliminate political interference at all operational and management levels. So process reforms would also be important in that regard. And then we have to reduce opportunities for corruption, essentially, which is to enshrine transparency such that it is not just a, or at the sway of potential leadership principles, and so that there are harsher consequences for that promotes transparency. It brings to mind the fact that in 2020, we had the published audit reports for NNPC, which was a huge coup because in the past 40 years, Nigeria hadn't seen that done yet. But still, there were laws that enabled NNPC to do this. But it was only until this administration that we had that being complied to. So some punitive measures would be important to ensure that that is adhered to. And then we suggest to consider publicly listing NNPC on a stock exchange potentially, which might also help with its funding issues. And then transparency issues I mentioned, having some penalty for non-compliance with laws. Then the final sort of conversation is around how do the 5 other NOCs perform on climate change governance and the energy transition agenda. So there's the TPI index, which provides sort of a guidance on how NOCs can be assessed in terms of how they manage their climate change governance framework and their climate change initiatives. So you have level 0 to be unaware of climate change as a business issue, level 1, acknowledging climate change as a business issue, then level 2, building capacity, 3, integrating into operational decision-making, and then 4, strategic assessment. It will not surprise us to know that Norway has achieved a level 4 in terms of, it's always been the leading sort of example in terms of best practices in the oil and gas industry. It sets a long-term quantitative target for reducing its greenhouse gas emissions, undertakes climate change scenario planning, remunerates execs based on climate change performance, etc. Of the 5, it's only Norway's Equinor and Brazil's Petrobras that actually have signed off or compliant to the TPI. The others have not quite, but they have other initiatives as well that emphasize their commitment to this. So finally, our recommendations for energy transition, we look at NNPC, just that NNPC must seize the energy transition as a business opportunity to save itself and Nigeria from its dangerous oil dependence, to diversify from oil into cleaner energy resources, to leverage examples from other NOCs as a source of inspiration and guidance on workable approaches, to run an institutional analysis of the role of key public and private institutions in the energy transition. With that, we encourage potentially understanding the roles of the key actors in that space. So the natural power utilities, the Ministry of Energy, private investors in power generation, and all international donors and all other players to ensure that this is adhered to. Then engage experts to develop an energy transition plan for Nigeria. So providing an integrated approach with all the different energy programs, which again, that opportunity was lost in terms of the PIB, but we can still have leverage what already exists to try and take advantage of this potential opportunity. And then establish clearly delineated objectives and responsibilities that are focused on carbon energy transition, potentially creating a dedicated unit or dedicated organization. We know that NNPC does have something similar to this. Potentially, this organization might focus on reducing carbon emission from existing and future oil and gas projects, potentially plan how to limit the number and type of projects that are those receipts from our exploitation of oil and gas resources, but we can look to the future and start to consider those as a potential option. Developing a new business strategy in renewable energy would also be a favorable consideration for Nigeria. Coordinating with private investors, all those other units that I initially mentioned, to try to forge a more holistic and robust approach moving forward. And ensuring that all our activities align with the Paris Agreement as well, looking into our gas flaring commitments, which deadlines continue to shift, looking into fast tracking, again, which was delayed because of the COVID-19 crisis, the commercialization of Nigeria's gas, and then also looking at establishing potential clear target metrics that are closely tied with the objectives of the end of NNPC. We can establish compliance timelines as well, just making sure that we have one that both Nigeria and NNPC can adhere to in ensuring that Nigeria lives up to its obligations. And then looking at funding sources for the new division or entity should be identified in advance and in ways that incentivize desired results. That is obviously one of the key areas where Nigeria can obviously leverage. We have different countries, even according to the Paris Agreement as well. You have any country that is looking to exploit renewables and cleaner form of energy will have a lot of funding options. So that's something that we recommend that Nigeria potentially exploits. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. I mean, you've highlighted what NNPC as an institution can leverage upon using its strategic advantage in the energy sector to be part of the transition process. But I think this conversation, we're happy to have a powerful representation from NNPC, and I think they can really dwell on this conversation. What do they think in terms of how do we manage the transition and what are the kind of role they can play in this? So that would be the next conversation. But thank you. Please make use of the Q&As live to respond to some of the questions being forwarded to you, because we don't have much time and we might not be able to go over all the questions. We can see there is a lot of passion going around and a lot of questions is being thrown out. Please use the Q&A section. Thank you. So we move over to the last panelist, which is Engineer Adeyemi Adetunji, the Chief Operating Officer, NNPC Ventures and Business Development. Thank you, sir. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So I'll try to share my screen. Can you see my picture now?
I think something is covering it. You need to remove the share one and enlarge the PowerPoint.
Sure. Okay.
I think you need to close it and. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So you can enlarge the PowerPoint and go ahead. Thank you.
It's okay now. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So good afternoon again. Good to be here and listen to Kingsmill and Tengi and just provide some perspective from an NNPC. So just go through these highlights essentially. We know that energy is fundamental, and fossil fuels still accounts for a large proportion of energy supply, for more than a century, and it's going to continue to be reckoning, going forward. And before COVID-19 pandemic in 2019, 2020, we did know that, the issue of climate change, has been on the agenda, of the world, and that has also put into perspective the role, and the future of the fossil fuel and energy industry. OPEC nations have continued, to depend, largely on the crude oil revenues, like called petrostates. And the COVID-19 pandemic, did also have impacts on Nigeria, just like all other countries in the world. And we did see, a contraction in the economy going from a 2.27% growth in 2019. However, Nigeria also, is committed, to carbon neutrality, and recently, Mr. President has committed to 2050, to have a net zero situation for Nigeria. Like we did say, the energy outlook, energy will continue to grow, and renewables will grow, but also oil and gas will grow. Oil definitely will not, in terms of the contribution to the energy mix in the world, will reduce, from about currently about 60% to about 68% in terms of the liquids. Gas will continue to grow, and renewables will grow also, in a much larger fashion, likely from about 15% to 28%, as we see on this slide. So yes, while renewable energy will grow in terms of the growth we can see here, which is massive, the fossil fuels, will still be in the reckoning, and Nigeria will, for us, we believe that we take advantage of that to create wealth, for diversify our economy into renewables and other parts, to ensure that we lift more people out of poverty. The government has a target to lift 100 million people out of poverty for the next 10 years. So revenue from oil and gas, will help us, to achieve all of that. We can see that last year from the COVID-19, there was a contraction. Initially, OPEC moved about 9.7 million barrels per day, from supply markets, from about 100 million barrels per day that the world consumes, to roughly about 90 million barrels. And today, what OPEC is what we're seeing in terms of supply to the market is about roughly about 95 million barrels per day, of crude oil, which is still, a healthy position. And Nigeria continues, 1.7 million barrels per day is what we achieve. Yes, indeed, the renewable energy has come, to stay. We can see, solar PV, in terms of the contribution, in terms of the cost, which the Kingsmill has dealt with, extensively, which is becoming to be a major factor in terms of energy production, energy mix globally. For Nigeria, we do recognize the fact that there will be transition, but we also recognize that we are coming from a base where we need to ensure that we move people out of poverty. We need to ensure energy access. We need to look at also ways, to maximize revenue from fossil fuels that we have, which we recognize is one of the key sources, of revenue to Nigerian government. What we're doing is to ensure that we do use those revenue sources, revenue at its end revenue, to really diversify the economy, the country. We go to renewable energy. We know the advantages, which again has been stated here, and I think has been dealt with, by both Tengi and Kingsmill. in their presentation. For NMPC, we have created, as part of our own contribution to the energy shift in the country, we created a renewable energy division. And renewable division, like I mentioned, is focusing on biofuels, looking at solar, and also going to explore, opportunities in wind, which will, come up with this. Currently, we're working in about 11 states, with 11 states in the country for various biofuels projects. We also have a number of MOUs, with some organizations for us to look at this solar space. And we are developing also an overarching strategy to ensure that we do look at the opportunities and take full advantage and move NMPC, really towards a large or sufficient contribution of renewable energy within our energy provision to the country and to its populace. The opportunities, that we see in terms from ethanol, we see going from about, in terms of the consumption, about 9.1 billion liters rather per year, but in the long term. And we do see also opportunities in terms of hydropower, biomass, solar, wind, geothermal, and also wave energy and tidal have a significantly less prospects, in Nigeria compared to the other sources of renewable energy. Like I mentioned, Nigeria also is committed, to the UN climate change, mitigation strategy and also objectives, and our promises, are also this year to reduce CO2, NO2, ethane, contribute by 20% unconditionally and 45% conditionally by year 2030. And we are going to walk through various means, like Tengi mentioned, look at the gas flaring to end, off-grid solar about 13,000 megawatts, efficient gas generators, look at also energy efficiency, which again is a major aspect for us to ensure that we are able to meet those climate change targets that we have set, and also to shift to look at the transformation of the transport sector, improve electricity grid, and also look at climate change, agriculture, and reforestation. One of the key aspects of Nigeria's energy strategy going forward is gas. Like I mentioned in my opening remarks. Nigeria has about 200. Nigeria, again, really like I said, in the industry, is really a gas country. We have more gas than we have oil, and gas being a much cleaner fossil fuel, we believe that also to leverage that gas resource to be able to create economic benefits, for the country. Again, our gas is both associated and non-associated. And currently, we produce about 8 billion cubic feet of gas per day. We know gas flaring has reduced. Our strategy is to reduce even more, the amount of gas that is flared. The key projects that we have for gas is basically gas to power. NMPC has about 10 gigawatts of gas projects in various aspects. We also have gas to industry. Recently, you could see that we've done some FID with brass fertilizer, a big project. So we're going to look more in terms of how we turn gas, to other industrial uses, fertilizer and other gas-based industries that we see. Fertilizer, because we are spending a lot more in those areas, ethanol and coal, all those will help to Nigeria to industrialize and improve the agricultural produce so that we're able to spend less in importation of food. We're also looking at LPG penetration. So we need to improve the use of LPG, which will help us to reduce deforestation. We're also looking at auto gas, and for us to look at CNG, LPG as means of transportation and reduce less dependence on on petrol and diesel. In addition, we're also going to look at EV ultimately as part of the overall strategy that I said is being developed, as we speak. So for us, the federal government, we are very much aligned and supportive of federal government commitments to the Paris climate change agenda. And we also support, the gas recomposition program that was established in 2016. The gas expansion program is the key agenda for this government and for the Ministry of Petroleum Resources and NNPC. The Green Development Mechanism, we also focused on that, and the Biofuels program and the whole renewable energy projects by NNPC are also being taken on with much vigor. In conclusion, we believe that the global energy transition, will also open opportunities for us, and we're putting in place, robust strategy, to ensure that we take full advantage of that, and turning NPC from pure oil and gas, to more cleaner organization with renewables for low carbon transition. I've listened to some of the comments by Tengi in terms of the way they have assessed NNPC vis-a-vis other benchmark NOCs, and I think maybe in the course of Q&A we'll be able to discuss some of the submissions that we made in that presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Engineer Adetunji Adeyemi, for that presentation, and you virtually saved us a lot of time. So I think now we can go into question and answer Q&A session, where we would open the floor for our participants to also ask questions. So I can see a lot of people have started using the Q&A section. So if your question has already been answered, you don't need to raise your hand. But if you still have question, there is a window, raise hand, that you can use to raise your hand, and I will call on you if you are picked. So, and you can ask your question from any of the three panelists, from the first panelist to the last one. So you are free to go either way. So I will start calling. So if you have questions, let me know. So we already have 3 people that have indicated that. So I will first of all call on Abiola Lawa. If you still have your question and if it has not been answered, you can go ahead. You can unmute yourself, Abiola Lawa.
Yes, thank you very much. The first thing I actually, as more of an administrative one, how would we get access to these presentations? We're trying to take copious notes, but it's difficult to catch most of those. So if you can let us understand how, whether those presentations.
So I mean, for that, we would, in the process of registration, we have all your emails, and we will share that with everyone after the webinar.
One particular question for NNPC, within the context of what we have seen by Kingsmill's presentation, we talk about gas, which is still a fossil fuel, and I heard we're being compliant in terms of direction about lower emissions and all that, but I don't see anything about EV strategy. And it becomes very difficult. I mean, maybe the better way to actually ask the question is, how do you square up the idea that we are directionally correct in terms of EVs and renewables when Nigeria is just building the largest, refinery in the world? I mean, we're never opening yet, 600,000 barrels very soon. What that tells me is that we're actually putting all our eggs primarily still on the fossil fuel petrol world. So can the panel talk about that? Because it seems very inconsistent in terms of what we're talking about and what we're actually putting dollar investments in. Thank you.
Thanks, Abiola Lawa, for that question. And that question is for Engineer Yemi Adetunji. So I will take two more questions before I go back to the panelists.
Across the board.
If you don't mind, so that we make best use of the time. So the second person I will call on is Benjamin Utu Teme. If you can ask your question now. You can unmute yourself now. Benjamin?
Hello?
Yes.
Yes. My question is directed to the NMPC man. He's talk about transiting to clean energy and all that, renewables. Is NMPC really interested in that, especially with all the projects they are signing? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think NMPC will answer that that question, but let me just note that, NMPC role is around petroleum, and their job is, that's their core task, and it's about are they in tune with the transition process, and what roles can they play as part of their mandate and strategic advantage. So, but it's in better position to do that. So the last person I will call upon is Chinelo Chinkelu. So you can unmute yourself, please.
Hello.
Chinelo, over to you.
Yes, can you hear me right now?
We can hear you.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you. You can talk.
So the first is, okay, so I have three questions. The first question is, how do we ensure that there's equal low energy transition across the regions of the country? I asked this because when when government says it's doing a lot of projects on solar and that, you hardly see any moving towards the south east, right? I barely see it, and this is really focused in Lagos and Abuja, all northern part of the country. All these places suffer epileptic supply. So the question is,
Chinelo, it seems the network. We can't hear you, Chinelo. Hello, Chinelo. We can't hear you. If you can drop your comment in the chat box, we can't hear you very well. If you can drop your comment in the chat box, that would be great. I think I will just quickly circle back to the representative of the NMPC, Engineer Adeyemi Adetuki. If you can quickly respond to that.
Okay, thank you very much. So the question was, why are we still investing in refineries? So I think the resource that we have, the fossil resource, hydrocarbon resource we have to monetize them. Yes, while we're going to transition, while we're transitioning, we know the need to transition to cleaner fuels and renewables. We have to use what we have to even create wealth, to be able to fund some of those projects, and importantly, to be able to move the economy of Nigeria, forward. Today, Nigeria, our target is about 2.1 million barrels per day of oil, and even if you add the Dangote refineries, about 600,000 barrels per day, with the NMPC1, it comes to about 1 million barrels per day. It will be, we believe strategically, it is well for us to be able to refine at least 1 million barrels per day, of crude in Nigeria. That will have impact in terms of, one, great energy supply security that we are looking for, and at the same time create those jobs and economic activities that will come from having refineries working in Nigeria. In addition to the petrochemicals, that will come from the various activities. Yes, we can still look for opportunities to earn foreign exchange by exporting the balance of what we are producing in the country. So, and we think even if you look globally, the share of EVs, you know, is still growing, but it's still small. And we believe that, for energy for IC engines will still be around, you know, for some time. Secondly, is people interested in renewable energy, given that we're signing projects? Yes, if we look at what we are doing, we are focusing on gas to power and gas-based industries. You know, the brass fertilizer is for fertilizer, it's for methanol, it's for those things that will help to Nigeria to further its industrialization agenda. And again, economies and industrialization is very important for us. We believe that for us to create a robust economy that will help us, you know, weather the storm and also reduce dependence, you know, on oil. By the way, we know that today, the oil and gas contribution to GDP of Nigeria is really about 15% thereabouts. So a lot of other sectors of the economy are actually doing quite well. And the more they're able to even use some of the petrol dollars to fund them, the better for the country. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that question. And I think at this moment, I want to quickly move to the other panelists because you've had a lot of questions from the chat box and Q&A tools. So first of all, let me call upon Kingsmill. If you can respond to some of the questions you have so far received, I have sent and share with you personally. I don't know, maybe in 2 minutes, if you can respond to that.
Sure, brilliant. I've tried to answer as many questions as I can on the chat, but I think, one of the, so if I just address some of the questions I've seen, so some of them is, for example, talking about the size of demand. And of course, financial markets don't care about size, they care about direction. Just look at the coal sector, for example. People are struggling to make money in the coal sector, even though there's still huge amounts of demand because there's overcapacity and therefore relatively low prices and low returns. There's some questions about the forecast for the future of demand. I think one of the forecasts came from the US EIA. I mean, the EIA is just not a serious forecasting organization. It's a kind of, it's just a mouthpiece for the fossil fuel industry. So their analysis is very weak and they always get it wrong. And it's interesting, for example, they've got rising demand for coal, which is just idiotic in a world where coal costs 2 or 3 times as much as alternative sources. So I think you've got to look very carefully at sources. I also think it's worthwhile thinking about this question about the correct allocation of limited resources. I mean, allocating money to a refinery at the end of the fossil fuel era is not diversification. It's doubling down on the bet on continuity of fossil fuel demand. So I think it's a very highly risky bet, and surely Nigeria has more pressing and superior opportunities to deploy its capital than building old fossil fuel assets. And then I guess there's a lot of questions also about what should we do, as the Russians say, что делать? What should we do? I mean, the answer is pretty clear. I mean, there's lots of very good research out there from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, the World Bank, and IRENA and others about what countries should do in order to exploit the opportunity, the renewable opportunity. And the answer is pretty clear, actually. You need a really clear policy environment in order to make this possible. Because what happens is that countries very often have energy systems controlled by incumbents, and incumbents want to carry on burning gas and block the development of these renewable energy technologies domestically. And that's great for them, but it's not actually great for the country because it stops people getting hold of cheap energy. And therefore you actually need very powerful governments to force through a better enabling policy environment. And that is a combination of things, but basically it's a question of changing the policy environment, setting targets and rules, and making land available and putting in place an auction system. Once you get auction systems in place, that drive costs down by about 20–30% very quickly. I mean, there's very, very clearly documented ways of doing this. So those are the questions I think I wanted to address. And then finally, somebody asked me about the OPEC forecast. I mean, look, OPEC again is not a serious forecasting organization. It's a tool of the oil incumbency.
Thank you, King Smith, for that response. So, thank you. I don't know, maybe you have any, you want to respond to some of the question that has been raised. But let me also add, I mean, one question that is quite striking for me is that how useful is the Natural Resource Charter framework in applying it to renewable energy sector? Is it applicable? What are the kind of refinements that it needs to undergo before we can say it's something that we can also use for such a sector? If you can respond to that in 2 minutes.
Okay. Thank you for that, DG. I'll address that in addition to a couple of, I think, questions that I think are good to note that I found in the chat section and in the question and answer section as well. So in terms of the Natural Resource Charter, you see in terms of enhancing Nigeria's ability to move forward, its institutions to move forward, like NNPC, for instance. I've mentioned the Precept 6. And in terms of looking at the energy strategy and the focus, looking at the larger energy mix and Nigeria's strategy for that, there is a precept that also speaks to that, which is the first precept. I didn't go in detail into that because that was not sort of the subject of my presentation, but there's something I can share. I can share sort of the larger precept considerations and how that's applicable after this session. And I'm sure that CC can obviously share that as well. We have other components around looking at the international perspectives of international policies on decarbonization, the climate change agreement, or how those fare and what Nigeria can do in terms of managing its natural resources, but also looking to appropriately engage in this in terms of its exposure for natural resources to those in the communities. So we look at gas flaring, we look at other sort of arrangements that can be used to minimize the exposure of fossil fuel extraction, sort of negative effects to those that are in those regions, for instance. So that can be applied for that realization. So towards carbon neutrality, that could be applicable to using the precepts and the charter for that. So there were other questions around, a very good one said that should Nigeria think of setting up another organ for renewables so that NNPC can focus on how to minimize stranded fossil fuel assets as the world goes to renewables? My concern here, and I think the recommendations that we made here, yes, we can look at a division or unit within NNPC. I'm wary of advising or advocating for an organ. I mean, a coordinating organ with all the energy sort of sectors, all the contributors, potentially power, oil and gas, etc. But I'm wary of an organ because of the way Nigeria works. When we have sort of a small arm looking at something very specific, we sort of go haywire. So maybe in the future, but I think a coordinating arm that coordinates all this, and NNPC can serve as that first line, because we're also we're looking at a climate change governance framework as well, which requires some approach towards carbon neutrality. I think it's important for NNPC to play a very pivotal role in that regard, and then draw the other factors and sectors in as well, which is why I talked about potential having NNPC reach out to the other players, international donors, private sector, states, governments, etc. as well, who are also providing or playing in that green energy space as well. And then there was another question that asked, that I noticed that one of your slides, you said Nigeria's oil industry is becoming a reminder of the past. How? As you mentioned, that the Nigerian extractive industry is now among the worst performing sectors, although due to the volume of money involved in this industry, it is quite hard to believe. What specific projects are ongoing to change this narrative? What I was speaking to here in my presentation was in terms of the coal story for Nigeria, where when oil sort of became, as most things are going concern, Nigeria moved away from other sectors. We have the coal story where there might be some remnants of environmental issues which went away when coal became a going concern. So the concern there for Nigeria as well is what happens when oil does as well. There are all these other pollutions and effects of extraction as well, which have been experienced in those regions. So it's important to sort of focus in on that to resolve it before oil becomes less of a going concern. And then in terms of Nigerian extractive industry is now among the worst performing sectors. I meant that in relation to the global oil and gas industry in reference to the S&P 500, where we saw a decline in returns for, using the ExxonMobil case, a decline in returns for shareholders, which again, companies operate to be profitable. So where that is no longer a going concern, you see a shift towards renewables. So it's important for Nigeria to align as well, because given the COVID-19 crisis, we are also competing for reduced resources. First of all, the shift to carbon to non-carbon to renewables, and then you have the competitive space as well, and you have companies taking more strategic decisions given the effects of COVID. We're still in COVID, we've not yet gone out of it. So there's still a lot of decisions being made that we need to sort of pay our minds to. So that's, I think those are the two questions I wanted to touch on.
Thank you for responding to those questions and highlighting the applicability and replicability of NNRC renewable energy sector. So lastly, I want to apologize to our attendees that still have questions. Given the time which has been fast spent, we will not be able to take your question. But I think I will give the floor to Engineer Adeyemi Adetunji for your last word. And if you can respond to Chinelo's Chikelu, that he has some question around how do we ensure equal level of low carbon energy transition across the region in the country? And how do we finance that, given situation in Nigeria around financial management and the rest? How do we finance this transition? Thank you. Over to you, sir.
Can you please, please repeat what you said last? I think we'll get a break.
So the question to you from Chinelu is, one, how do we ensure energy transition across regions in Nigeria? I mean, we know we talk about geopolitical zones in Nigeria. How do we ensure that when we talk about transition, it's not just for one region, it's spread across the region? And secondly, how do we finance it, given the issue of financing issue that's that is so germane in a lot of our conversation as a country? How do we finance the transition?
Okay, thank you very much. So again, like we know that various parts of the country have advantages in terms of weather, land, and other means of production, for renewable energy. Like we do know that the northern part of Nigeria is more amenable, or best amenable to solar. Wind in some parts of the northern part of the country, and some part of the southern part of the country, the coastal region. So the energy agenda that we are developing in NPC is going to look at the advantages we have in those various parts of the country, and then targeted the projects around there. I mentioned earlier that biofuels program that we have is for 11 states, and those 11 states are spread across the various geopolitical zones of the country. In addition, you recall that the federal government has a solar initiative to reach for 5 million homes, which will, again, that will be about 25 million individuals in the country. That's also spread, across the various geopolitical zones in the country. And other initiatives that the Energy Commission of Nigeria is also coordinating and championing, is around various parts of the country. It's not limited, or focused on a particular part of the country, but, is going to have wide appeal in terms of footprints. We touch each and every part of the country. In terms of financing, I think just like has been mentioned, some of this there needs to be some policy improvements on the policy framework that we have to make it more attractive for the financial sector, financial institutions to be able to see energy, renewable energy, to fund them to the level that want to fund them. But again, we are working with various stakeholders in NNPC, working with various stakeholders across the country to ensure that those in terms of advocacy, for the various changes and improvement we want to see in the policy and the fiscals, that will ensure that financing becomes more available to the sector for renewable energy. Thank you
so much for that contribution. And with that, I think I want to appreciate our panelists for a wonderful job in addressing this important issue about how do we manage our resources, which is oil, and how do we ensure that we don't end up with what King Smith calls unspent assets. I mean, we don't, I mean, an asset that is not useful. So thanks for those kind of your contribution and your participation in this. So I would move and hand over to Jochen for closing remarks and to wrap up the event.
Yeah, thanks, Deji. Mine is also just to thank everyone, thank Kingsmill, Tanguy, and Yemi for their contributions and for their willingness to join this conversation. And I think the conversation has clearly outlined the challenge in the form of a inescapable energy transition as outlined by Kingsmill in very from a Nigerian perspective concerning terms and graphics, while at the same time we know what the solutions are, we know where the potential is to become fit for the future, and as Tanguy also has outlined, some really specific actionable steps that can be taken also from the perspective of the NNPC to make itself fit for the future and prevent a scenario where the NNPC itself may be at risk to become a stranded asset, and maybe not in the short term, but in the medium to long term. And really time now to think about these issues and change course. And I think also mentioned by Tanguy, the process around the petroleum industry bill, the reform process of the industry, I think needs to acknowledge the energy transition, which it currently really doesn't. It is focused on how to make the sector more transparent, more efficient, and it is there to make sure that Nigeria gets a better deal out of oil and gas, and that's important, of course. That's a good thing. But I think at the same time, what needs to be built into that discussion and process is an acknowledgement that Nigeria actually needs to come up with a roadmap of how it will align itself with the realities that will just force themselves onto the country, whether Nigeria likes that or not, unfortunately. So yeah, with that, thank you everyone. Thanks everyone for staying with us for so long. As it has been mentioned earlier, we will make sure that you will get all the presentations, and we also hope that we can set up other engagements in the future that delve a bit deeper in some of the aspects that were touched on today, which was a fairly broad discussion on an important topic, but fairly high level as one in terms of the observations and possible solutions. So thank you very much for that, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Jochen, and bye to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Jochen. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.